Madame la Présidente, aujourd'hui, je vais partager mon temps avec l'Honorable Deputy Carlton. Before I start a real speech here, Madam Speaker, I want to talk about the basics, because I think the basics are sometimes lost. And seeing yesterday's budget, I think there are a lot of basics that were lost. But let's start with the definition of budget from my honorable colleagues. A budget is an estimation of revenue and expenses over a specified future period of time and is usually compiled and reevaluated on a periodic basis. To manage expenses, prepare for unpredictable events, and be able to afford big ticket items without going into debt, budgeting is important. Keeping track of how much you earn and spend doesn't have to be drudgery, doesn't require to be good at math, and doesn't mean you can't buy the things you want. It just means you'll know where your money goes, you'll have greater control over your finances. Aside from earmarking resources, a budget can also aid in setting goals, measuring outcomes, and planning for contingencies. A budget deficit occurs when expenses exceed revenue and indicate the financial health of a country. Accrued deficits form national debt. In cases where a budget deficit is identified, current expenses exceed the amount of income received through standard operations. A nation wishing to correct its budget deficit may need to cut back on certain expenditures, increase revenue-generating activities, or employ a combination of the two. Certain unanticipated events and policies may cause budget deficits. One of the primary dangers of a budget deficit is inflation, which is the continuous increase of price levels. Continued budget deficits can lead to inflationary monetary policies year after year. A nation can print additional currency to cover payments on debts by issuing securities such as treasury bills and bonds. While this provides a mechanism to make payments, it does carry the risk of devaluing the nation's currency, which can lead to hyperinflation. Now, why do governments run deficits? Well, a budget deficit planned to be this large is based on two things: tolerance from taxpayers and financial institutions that bear the risk, and the notion of not having to pay back temporary support mechanisms. In effect, leading up to a federal election, this government doesn't want to take away the sugar bowl, but there is guaranteed to be a hangover from this sugar high. The national debt is simply the net accumulation of the federal government's annual budget deficits. It is the total amount of money that the federal government owes to its creditors. And that amount has gone from $700 billion 2 years ago, approximately, to $1.2 trillion at this point. Debt to GDP. This is a ratio of a country's national debt to the level of economic activity in that country. It's a meaningless ratio that was put in place at a time when the world's central bankers could no longer find the tools to balance national budgets. The concept of permanent national debt, permanently paying institutions with taxpayer funds, became accepted by the world's bankers, both private and public. The concept upended the very notion of Keynesianism, where governments were encouraged to spend in bad times and repay that spending in good times, thus maintaining equilibrium in labor and price levels in society. It was also a measure of comparing bad fiscal regimes with other bad fiscal regimes, as in, we're in bad shape, but as a function of our GDP, we're not in as bad shape as those other guys, which is a ridiculous point, given that every national economy and democratic and financial structure are different. Cette stratégie peut être résumée dans le proverbe « Je me regarde, je me désole. Je me compare, je me console ». Companies have debt to revenue multipliers. It's about the equivalent. However, these entities deliver value to their shareholders by maintaining a balance of risk, as in too much debt and interest payments, and return. In addition, companies can expense debt before calculating taxes, the amount they owe the government for their profits. Do governments pay taxes and have a favorable application of carrying debt on their balance sheet? No. It is only a burden transferred from today's taxpayers to tomorrow's taxpayers, or in this government's approach, when things really go south down the road, and then in a huge problem scenario. The risk borne here is multiplying, and the bearers of that risk are future taxpayers. Moral hazard. Moral hazard exists when a party to a contract takes risks without having to suffer the consequences. Build back better. It turns out that Build Back Better is not a political slogan. It refers to the official Sendai framework of disaster recovery that was adopted at the UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Sendai, Japan in 2015. Its definition is broad enough to cover any disaster scenario. build back better from which disaster in Canada? Which brings us to yesterday's budget announcement. Good news. Canada's forecast annual deficit for last year improved by $35 billion from the fall economic statement. That's extra funds that arrived in taxation revenue from businesses restarting mid-pandemic and Canadians getting back to work to pay government taxes. Much of that arrived from Canada's traditional strengths: mining, energy, agriculture, and manufacturing. Essential industries keeping the rest of the country fed, warm, and solvent. I'm sure the Minister of Finance should be taking credit for 1 million jobs coming back to Canada, given these results that are already arriving. Last year's deficit number is $354 billion for one level of government, the federal government, whose annual revenue is usually about that amount. So $2 were spent for every dollar brought in a normal year, but even more from a year when government revenues were down by around 8%, to deal with the health and economic effects of a historic pandemic. Well, okay. And to build back better and to reimagine Canada's economy. These empty slogans represent nothing but political jingoism. Canada's deficit in 2019, $27 billion in a $2.3 trillion economy, was about 8.3% of government revenues. In an economic boom, Canada was overspending by 8.3%. Here's the rationale from the Liberal Prime Minister about running deficits in boom times on March 21st, 2016 in this House. Mr. Speaker, record low levels of interest rates right now mean that this is an opportunity to invest in our future. This is what we are delivering to grow the economy and help the middle class. In contrast, in this year's budget announcement, the Minister of Finance said the following: the best way to pay our debts is to grow our economy. In fact, in today's low interest rate environment, not only can we afford these investments, it would be short-sighted of us not to make them. Now, by investments, of course, they mean government spending. Clearly at odds, these two, Madam Speaker, but it is obvious that neither this Prime Minister nor this Finance Minister understand the notion of financial risk. And clearly, this Liberal government will justify spending taxpayer funds in good times, and to spend taxpayer, it begs the question, what times are not good for overspending taxpayer funds? The forecast budget deficit for this fiscal year coming, according to yesterday's budget, $154.7 billion. That is almost $50 billion higher than forecast in the fall economic statement, despite last year's revenues outperforming by $35 billion since the fall. Planned spending represents an increase of $136 billion in planned spending over the next 5 years, in addition to the $548 billion in spending forecast in the fall economic statement. How is this justified? These deficits accumulate to an ongoing debt to GDP ratio at 50% going forward. So the plan, the fiscal anchor, is to maintain Canada's debt at half the size of our economy for the foreseeable future. Is that an anchor? The better our economy performs, the deeper in debt we get to go? We say in finance that every economic forecast is wrong. From the moment it is written, and rightly so, things change, and getting close based on discipline and unforeseen extraneous events coming at you spells success. There's none of that in this budget. There is no security for our children. There is multiplying risk. It's our job to leave this country in better shape than we found it. Fiscally, and in so many other ways, we are failing. C'est notre devoir de laisser ce pays en meilleure forme que nous ne l'avons trouvé. Sur le plan financier et à bien d'autres égards, nous sommes en échec. What's right about this budget? Well, the Minister of Finance spoke about taxing foreign owners of unoccupied real estate in Canada, part of our Made in Canada housing bubble, but also a hole in our money laundering laws in Canada, which are the loosest in the G7, and they need to be tighter. I'm pleased that the Minister of Finance has followed our lead in applying an investment tax credit on carbon credit utilization and storage.
Go to questions. We have to go to questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Adams.
Carbon credit utilization whatever that was, Madam Speaker, the Conservatives' plan to price pollution is one that will only give benefit to those who pollute. As a matter of fact, it just encourages people to pollute. I do admire, though, my Conservative colleagues, and I know the member from Carleton has spent a lot of time talking about the price on pollution. I admire their willingness to come in here and try to defend such a plan after 5 years of talking about how price on pollution wasn't the right way. And now they have this grand plan of putting your money into a savings account and then letting you choose from the CPC boutique what you'd like to spend. But the reality is, Madam Speaker, that's not a plan to fight pollution. That's not a plan to price carbon. That's just Conservatives trying to give to people who are wealthy and to people who have money to make sure that they can keep the money in their pocket, rather than making sure that we take all the funds and distribute it equally as we're currently doing.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Oh, I thank the member from Kingston and the Islands for pointing out my stumble, and thank you, Madam Speaker, for allowing me to correct it. I'm pleased that the Minister of Finance has followed our lead in applying an investment tax credit for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, one of Canada's most tangible opportunities to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. A 90-day consultation period has been announced, and I encourage the government to consider the benefits associated with enhanced oil recovery as part of that strategy, as it is in the United States, and to move toward an environmental strategy that halts the flow of jobs and investments, including technological advancements like carbon capture, to foreign jurisdictions with no positive effect on the environment. Canada needs regulatory certainty, particularly regarding our environmental objectives. Having a carbon capture strategy that moves jobs and investment to our largest trading partner is not a viable environmental strategy for Canada. I encourage the Minister of Finance to get this right so that it actually results in effective policy. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député d'Avignon, Lamitis, Matane, Matapédia.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie mon collègue pour son discours et j'aimerais l'entendre à propos de l'aide qui est accordée aux aînés dans ce budget. Le gouvernement a choisi délibérément de créer 2 classes d'aînés en augmentant la pension de la sécurité de la vieillesse à partir de 75 ans au lieu de le faire à partir de 65 ans, ce qui crée une injustice pour des milliers d'aînés au pays. Et en plus de ça, il choisit d'envoyer un chèque unique de 500 $ à un bien curieux moment, à la fin de l'été, peut-être à la veille d'un déclenchement électoral. J'aimerais savoir, selon mon collègue, est-ce qu'il pense que les libéraux, avec ces mesures-là, font de la politique sur le dos des aînés du Québec et du Canada?
L'honorable député de Calgary Centre.
Well, I thank my colleague very much for the question. It is strange the timing of all the expenses that seem to be flowing out of the Liberals at this point in time and attaching themselves to the budget. There is something that we need to do for our seniors. The pandemic has exposed one thing, and that is how we have had a hole in the health treatment of our seniors that we did not pay enough attention to. Adjusting those structural problems going forward is fundamentally important. And we've noticed for a long time that seniors at all levels require more support in our society. I'm not sure the OAS, the old age security, is the best way of approaching that, but I do think it should be examined with all the tools we have in our kit. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Esquimalt, Saanich-Sooke.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member of Calgary Centre for his speech. It may surprise him that I also share his concern about continually running large deficits. I consider myself a Tommy Douglas New Democrat. Tommy ran 17 balanced budgets in his 17 years as Premier. But here's the situation we find ourselves in. Canadians need help to get through the pandemic. Businesses need assistance to make sure they survive and can hire back their workers. And so we have 2 choices. We can either deny that assistance, which the Conservatives seem to favor, or we can put in place a tax on those who have made excess profits during the pandemic. The ultra rich, we can restore corporate income tax rates to their levels from 30 years ago, which the Conservatives and Liberals both cut. So which is it? Do the Conservatives want to deny Canadians the aid they need in order to maintain a balanced budget? Or are they prepared to join New Democrats in calling for a wealth and excess profits tax?
Honourable member for Calgary Centre, 15 seconds.
Well, I appreciate the question from my colleague, and I would say that we are very much engaged with the government on the changes that we brought to them on the emergency wage subsidy. We're very happy that they were able to deliver those to Canadians that needed those during the pandemic. It's something that we're quite proud of as a caucus and as a party, that we actually were able to deliver aid after the Liberals had initially put forward a